Tariq's a cloud security researcher and detection engineer at Lacework with a focus on endpoint detections. Tariq's submission proposed some ways for dealing with very different procedure scopes between different various attack techniques and tactics, and we're looking forward to hearing about them today. Please welcome Tariq to the stage.
Thank you very much.
Should have slides up this.
I was just saying, this is a very interesting pairing because Lauren just told us about which techniques to focus on. What I will be talking to you about is basically which techniques not to focus on. So, how did we get here? A few years back, one of my clients came to me with what was then a relatively new framework called minor attack. And his idea was quite simple. If we have all these kind of various techniques, if we write a detection for each one of these, we should be done, right? Like we detected everything, right? Well, I remember at the time telling him, like, yeah, that's not how it works. What I wasn't able to tell him at the time was, well, how does it work? And basically, after a lot of kind of thinking about this, it boils down to, there's obviously different ways of answering this question, but this is one level of it, is that attack is a framework that caters to a lot of different teams with a lot of different needs. The amount of details in any part of the framework, your tactics, your techniques, your data sources, might cater better to some parts of the cyber organizations than other parts of the cyber organization. So we go back to the original question. If I am pretending to be the detection team, I am the detection engineering team, which techniques, which parts of this framework that we're talking about today are relevant to me and not, and which ones are not? So we do bottom line up front. This is the exclusion matrix that we're gonna end up with. We will build this very slowly, but those of you who are keen-eyed will notice the execution tactic entirely blacked out. That's the elephant in the room. We will build to that. We will get there. But let's start with something a little bit less controversial. Let's start with data sources. So attack defines data sources to a lot of the techniques in the framework. Some techniques do not have any data sources defined. So if I want to kind of detect this technique, these are the data sources that I need to monitor. If the technique does not have a data source defined, that means that by definition, you cannot detect said technique. Here's an example. Gather victim org information, business relationships. This is very much a technique that you do when you're kind of in your reconnaissance. You can obviously see all the techniques in the pre-attack side of the house. So open source intelligence, there isn't a single data source that I can kind of monitor in order to provide me with the information to detect this technique. So we mark these as undetectable. Okay, and here's the zoomed in version. By the way, for anyone who's interested, I have all the attack navigator layers available on a link. I will provide that link at the end of this presentation. Those of you who are in the Q&A Slack channel, that link is already in there. So if you are interested in this, all the information related to this is available. Okay, so let's move on and let's stick with data sources just for a sec. Some data sources in attack are focused on kind of what I call global level of monitoring. So we're talking about scanning the entirety of the internet, or monitoring every DNS lookup, or monitoring every certificate registration. Now, if you're a CTI team that is focused on this type of stuff, better yet, if you're a CTI company that is focused on this type of stuff, this might be very relevant to you. But if you are a detection engineering team in a relatively sized company, this very much kind of spells too much work for the effort, especially since, as you can see, we're still dealing with pre-attack in recon and reconnaissance. Recon and resource development. Okay, so we mark all the techniques right here as undetectable. I will give you an example of one such technique. So, acquire infrastructure. In order to detect acquire infrastructure, what you do is you scan the entirety of the internet, looking for attacker infrastructure. And if you stumble upon the relevant infrastructure, good for you. If you don't, well, yeah, you scanned the whole internet, so good on you. Like I said, very useful for people who specialize in this type of CTI work. It is not useful for me as a detection engineering team. That's not what I do on a day-to-day basis. Okay, again, zoomed in version. You can use the link for a kind of better view of this. Okay, firmware modification. So firmware modification is listed as a data source in attack. I should mention most SOCs do not collect firmware modification as a data source. And there's a very good reason, very simple reason for that. It's not that the tooling cannot exist. You can theoretically, create software that would monitor for firmware modification. It is that by the time the attacker is modifying your firmware, you really shouldn't trust anything from that machine at this point. So yeah, anything that depends on firmware modification as a data source is not something that you can detect. So we mark these techniques as undetectable. Again, zoomed in version. Okay, phishing. And I have to admit, this is as personal a kind of choice as it gets, but work with me. There are a lot of techniques that are listed under different tactics. Phishing is kind of unique in that it is listed under multiple tactics, but phishing is, and I'm looking at Adam as I say this. Phishing is unique because there's different versions of phishing, slight variations in the different tactics. So phishing for information is different than internal spear phishing, different than just plain vanilla phishing. Now, if you're like me and you prefer fewer techniques to worry about than more techniques to worry about, yeah, I'm just going to disable the reconnaissance and the lateral movement version and focus on the initial access one, just because, again, I have enough problems already. But yeah, this is as personal a choice as it gets. I don't usually do phishing on a day-to-day basis. That's a different team. So for me, in the detection engineering team, yeah, somebody's handling phishing, I can ignore it and move on. Okay, zoomed in version again. I couldn't figure out a way to kind of make these, like I seriously tried. I honestly tried. Anyways, detectable techniques. So far we've spoken a lot about techniques that are still in the pre-attack side of the house. Some of you might be asking, well, yeah, we just ignore pre-attack and just move on. For the sake of doing this systematically, I need to point out that there are techniques in pre-attack that are detectable. So you have scanning IPs or web scraping, basically, or vulnerability scanning. Those are techniques in pre-attack that you technically can detect. Now, the first two, scanning IPs, scraping websites, yeah, you can detect it, but at that point, like, what do you do about it? Like, somebody scanned your IPs, so what? Vulnerability scanning is where you start to kind of get into, should we care about this? Like, how bad was the vulnerability scanning? What did they find? But yeah, for the sake of kind of completeness' sake, there are things that you can detect in pre-attack. Okay, and zoomed in version again, which gets us to 4 remaining techniques in pre-attack. This is where it gets kind of, I'm not entirely sure if we have all the information for this. Okay, so the first 2, gather victim identity information and, email addresses and word list scanning. Basically, what we're doing is You're scraping the website. Once you've scraped the website, you're looking for either word lists or email addresses. The web scraping I can detect. I've showed you this in the previous slide. What I cannot detect is the intention of the person doing the scraping. If they're looking for email addresses, I cannot say like, yeah, they were looking for email addresses. Like they scraped the website. I don't really know what was. I'm not a mind reader. That's not what I do. So yeah, these first two I'm marking as undetectable simply because they are basically variations of the previous one. As far as I'm concerned, in the detection engineering team, they're the same thing. As far as red teamers, on the other hand, this might be useful because you're describing your kind of methodology. You're saying, yeah, we were looking for this thing, we were looking for that thing. So yeah, it's useful for you if you're a red teamer. But again, for me in detection engineering, not so useful. The other two is where it starts getting a little bit tricky. So compromised accounts, social media accounts, and established accounts, social media accounts. The data source that is listed for this is network traffic content. I'm not entirely sure how that would work. So there are one of two options. Either I'm kind of monitoring the traffic going to my website, looking for social media accounts, at which point we go back to, I don't really know what the intention, like once they get they've done the scraping, I don't really know what their intention was. The other part is I'm monitoring the network traffic content of Facebook, and I'm not really sure. Like I've called Facebook, I've told them like, hey, I want to monitor your network traffic. They put me on hold. They haven't gotten back to me yet. But yeah, so as far as I'm concerned, this isn't something that I can detect. Again, we're still talking about pre-attack, so it's not that big of a deal anyway. But since we are talking about network traffic content, I marked that data source as basically blacklisted that data source. I just wanted to see what happens. And notice what I get. I get a few more techniques on command and control. So let's take a look at them. So the first three are stuff that you actually do. What do I mean by that? So data obfuscation is something that you do. You have data, you try to obfuscate it. Same thing with doing domain fronting. I don't want the defenders to know where I'm going, so I do domain fronting. Same thing with DNS calculation. This is something that I do. This is something that is active, so I can detect it. What I cannot detect is data encoding, because between the two kind of techniques of standard encoding and non-standard encoding, that's pretty much every single piece of information that has ever existed. But I cannot detect every single piece of information that has ever existed. Now, if you're a CTI person, this is very helpful for you, because you're saying like, yes, this is encoded in this way, or this encoded in that way. The encoding itself is legitimate. Fair enough. But for me, in detection engineering, not very useful. That said, standard encoding is the, what's the word I'm looking for? Standard. Non-standard encoding is the aberration here. I'm a detection engineer. I can detect aberrations. So if there is a hypothetical threat actor that has created a data encoding so abhorrent that it is so unique that I can detect it on, it is theoretically possible that I can detect based on the non-standard encoding. Standard encoding, on the other hand, is again standard. I cannot detect standard behavior. Encrypted channel is the same thing, except this time I have two equally unique, equally valid sub-techniques. I have asymmetric cryptography and symmetric cryptography. Both of these are equally valid, so I cannot detect them because, yeah, that's everything. That's every encrypted channel that is ever used. Okay, so based on this, I get these extra techniques that I've marked as undetectable. Which brings us to the technique that has given me the most heartache ever, my personal nemesis, valid accounts. And I'm not even joking, because like if we talk about like any CTI report, they're gonna list the techniques that are being used in the particular attack campaign, whatever that they're talking about. Okay, except that valid accounts by definition is pretty much everything that has ever been executed, because everything that is executed is done using valid accounts. So of course they're gonna put that in their report. And then somebody comes in and with the great idea of let's aggregate those and find the most common techniques. And guess what techniques bubbles up to the top? Valid accounts. And then they come to me and they ask me to detect it. And I'm like, how? It is valid accounts. How do I detect it? So yes, I'm not joking when I say like this is my personal nemesis as far as techniques are concerned. I should say, so I'm obviously gonna mark it as undetectable, which is pretty nice because it is covered, listed under different tactics. I should say, as far as detection of this type of behavior, my team does a lot of work with user behavior, behavioral analytics. Basically, what we're saying is this behavior is normal. It's just not normal to you. So that's how we do kind of detections. We do tag it as valid accounts simply because that's the most convenient place to put it. But yeah, the fact that we are saying this is valid behavior doesn't spell kind of technique to me. So yeah, I'm marking it as undetectable, even though we do tag detections with it. So yeah, do with that whatever you want to do with that. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, the execution tactic in all of its entirety. You cannot detect the techniques in the execution tactic. And there's a very good reason for that. That is every single instruction that has ever been executed on any processor ever, anywhere, that is as valid as it gets. So, and again, I'm a detection engineer. I don't detect valid behavior. I detect aberrations. But you're not convinced. So let me tell you a little bit more. These are the tactics in the attack framework. Officially or unofficially, these map to phases in the kill chain. You start with initial access, you do your privilege escalation, you do your lateral movement, you do your impact or exfiltration, etc., etc. Execution is the odd one out, because you're never really not doing execution. Not convinced? Let me add a little bit more. This is an example from Atomic Red Team. This is the example for testing PowerShell. We love you, Atomic Red Team guys, wherever you're sitting. Just this is not testing PowerShell as a technique. Notice, what am I doing here? PowerShell, download string from URL. What I'm doing here is ingress tool transfer. That's the bit that is important. Once I've downloaded the thing, I'm doing invoke mimikatz. That's accessing LSAS memory. That is, those two techniques are what is happening in that command line. PowerShell is just the execution medium. It is not the actual technique here. If I focus on PowerShell as a technique, what I have to do as a detection engineer is say, based on this syntax right here, I need to detect this particular attack. If I am focusing on the thing that is actually happening, I can say, you know what? I don't want to invoke the word invoke Mimikatz because you know what? It's just a word. They can change it. They can say invoke Mimi dogs or some other word that doesn't even have Mimi in it. What I can do instead is focus on the actual access to the process into LSAS memory. For the download of the script, I can review proxy logs. But if I focus on on PowerShell as a technique and not a data source, that means that I'm fixed to using the actual syntax right here. Still not convinced. This is the good example from Atomic Red Team. There are examples in Atomic Red Team where it's like, yeah, you create a container and you deploy it and you detect it. It's like, well, where's the actual kind of malicious behavior here? There isn't any, because deploy container is not malicious activity. That's not what the technique is doing. This is an execution medium. It's an attack medium. It is not a technique in of itself. Still not convinced? Let me do a Darth Vader thing. Search it in your heart. You know it to be true. Every time you had trouble detecting something, every time you said like, you know what, this thing is not working. That was the execution tactic, wasn't it? So yeah, this isn't something that you can detect. And the more we the sooner that we can agree that this is something that we cannot detect, the more time that we can focus on detecting what actually matters. And this is where we do a teeny bit of nuance here, which is there are, again, techniques that are listed under multiple tactics. So for example, system services is listed under execution, but it is being used for things like privilege escalation or persistence. You can detect these techniques in the kind of capacity that they are being used for privilege escalation or persistence. You cannot detect them as far as execution is concerned, because if we're being honest, nobody really kind of spins up a new service just because, you know, I need to run a command. Let me just spin up a new service. So yeah, that's a nuance in all of this. So we put it all together, and this is the exclusion matrix that I was telling you about. If you are interested, like I said, at the link, you can download this attack navigator layer and use it yourself. What does this mean to you? This tool is, I think, better used for kind of future planning. So if something is in this exclusion matrix, don't spend too much time on it. If you have rules that are already tagged but, for anything in this exclusion matrix, don't go about disabling these rules, because it is detecting something. It's just probably not what you think it is detecting, not the technique that it is tagged for. So yeah, don't do that. What you should do is try to figure out which techniques to focus on. And that gets us into the realm of threat modeling, which is a totally different rabbit hole, and I don't have time for it. Lauren has already given us a very nice kind of introduction on the matter. Yeah, but don't go about disabling any of these rules. Who is this crazy person who's trying to append everything that we do? My name is Tariq Al-Khatib. I'm a cloud security researcher at Lacework. If you haven't figured it out by now, I am kind of mostly focused on the detection engineering side of the house. And yeah, I spend a little bit too much time on the attack side, more than I care to kind of admit. That link at the top right there, that's where you can download the attack navigator layers. If you do want to follow me, LinkedIn, that's my LinkedIn profile right now. LinkedIn has also not provided me with their network traffic content for review, so like I still can't detect that technique for LinkedIn either. But it is what it is. There are too many trenches. There aren't enough of us to fill those trenches. The sooner that we can focus on what actually works, the better. Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
We do have time for questions. That was a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the way, even up front, you scoped it as, rather than looking at, malicious or benign and trying to look at attack and figure out what to do, figure out what you're capable of, figure out what logs you have, and then start deploying it.
Exactly.
Love that. And I don't know if you noticed, we were kind of having a little bit of an inside joke. Cloud lead up front, Casey, as soon as you start talking about valid accounts, T1079, 78, sorry, it's one of the ones we have memorized because... Yeah. Send it still up our spine. A lot to deal with here. I do have a question, but I don't want to monopolize. I'll try to check my bias if anyone in the back is also interested. Over here.
I just need a question for clarity. So you have an exclusion list as those does that also say that those techniques can still be used against you? You just don't have a way to detect them.
Oh, 1 second. Can I repeat for the online audience?
Yes,
so the
please.
question was basically, do you have an exclusion list to, once you identify it, a technique is not necessarily high priority or even possible to detect, how do you deal with kind of filtering out that noise?
So it differs from technique to technique. I've excluded a whole bunch of different techniques based on different reasons. For example, the pre-attack ones, obviously, you don't have a data source, so you cannot detect them. For the kind of firmware modification ones, for example, that one, you may be able to detect the kind of infection leading up to the firmware modification. But like I said, by that point, it's not that you cannot detect it. It's more like you've already lost at that point. So yeah, there's a whole kind of spectrum of things here. So I can't really give you a one size fits all. But the whole idea is your time is limited. So I'm just trying to tell you, these are the things that you for various reasons, you probably that's not the most useful use of your time. They focus on the other stuff. Now, like I said, what other stuff that you need to focus on comes a question of threat modeling, which is again totally different rabbit hole.
So a quick one for me. I'm not a detection engineer, but I can maybe play one on TV.
Yeah.
What we were looking at, I think you outlined it really well, is very often there's not a one-to-one between adversary behavior and a technique.
Yes.
In the same way, what are your thoughts on that same relationship between detections and techniques? A good example was the Red Canary. It's PowerShell, it's download Cradle, it's OS credential dumping.
Yeah.
Is that potentially too complex, or what's the kind of trade-off there?
So I personally, whenever kind of facing with this type of situation, if a rule is detecting more than one thing, I'm more than happy to tag it as more than one thing. It does create a many-to-many kind of relationship, but that's what we have graph databases for, I guess.
Defenders should think in graphs as well.
Yes.
Well, small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I can do this. Thank you very much.